The morning of June 15th, 1944. A field hospital outside Imphal, northeast India. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi stood in the doorway of a captured British aid station, his uniform torn and stained with mud from weeks of retreat through monsoon jungle. Behind him, the remnants of his 15th Army staggered down mountain trails, their bodies racked with malaria, dysentery, and wounds that would not heal. The Burma campaign had become a graveyard of Japanese ambition, but it was not the defeat that made Mutaguchi's hands tremble as he stepped into the medical tent. It was what he found inside. Stacked against the canvas walls were wooden crates, stamped with American markings. Medical supplies, captured during a brief successful raid on an Allied position 3 days earlier. His medical officer, a gaunt surgeon named Captain Tanaka, knelt beside one of the opened boxes, his face drained of colour. In his hands he held a glass bottle filled with amber liquid, its label printed in crisp English, "Dried human plasma." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lyophilized, U.S. Army Medical Department. Mutaguchi had seen plasma before, in Tokyo hospitals, reserved for the most critical cases, in university research laboratories, discussed in hushed tones as experimental medicine. But never here, never at the front, never in quantities measured in hundreds of units, stored casually in field hospitals as if they were bandages or aspirin. Tanaka looked up, his voice barely audible above the rain hammering the tent roof. "Sir, they have enough plasma here to treat an entire division, and this is just one aid station." The general said nothing. He moved deeper into the tent, his boots squelching on the muddy floor. More crates, more bottles, plasma, whole blood derivatives, albumin, gamma globulin, medical supplies that existed in Japanese military doctrine only as theoretical concepts. Here they sat in abundance, waiting to save lives that would otherwise be lost to shock and hemorrhage. Outside, Japanese soldiers lay dying in the mud, not from enemy bullets, but from wounds that had become infected during the long retreat, from blood loss that could not be replaced, from shock that turned young men into corpses within hours. The Japanese army marched with medics carrying bandages and morphine, tourniquets and prayer. The Americans, it seemed, marched with an entire hospital's worth of life-saving technology in every forward position. Mutaguchi picked up one of the plasma bottles, turning it slowly in his hands. The glass was cool, perfectly sealed, the contents preserved through some industrial process he could only guess at. This single bottle represented medical capability that Japan's entire pharmaceutical industry struggled to produce. And the Americans had thousands of them, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, scattered across every theatre of war. The mathematics of the discovery settled over him like physical weight. If America could deploy plasma to frontline aid stations in the jungles of Burma, in quantities sufficient to treat mass casualties, then the industrial and logistical capacity required was beyond anything Japanese intelligence had calculated. This was not merely advanced medicine. It was advanced medicine delivered to the edge of combat, sustained through supply chains crossing oceans, maintained in tropical heat and monsoon rain. Japan could not do this. Japan had barely managed to supply its armies with rice and ammunition during the Burma offensive. Plasma, refrigerated, carefully packaged, accompanied by trained technicians who knew how to reconstitute and administer it, was so far beyond Japanese logistical capability that it seemed almost fictional. Yet here it sat, real, tangible, undeniable. Captain Tanaka stood, holding up a technical manual he had found in another crate. "Sir, they have protocols, step-by-step instructions for corpsmen with minimal training. They have made this simple enough that any soldier can administer it in the field." Mutaguchi took the manual. The pages were illustrated with clear diagrams, printed on waterproof paper, designed for use in combat conditions. The Americans had not merely invented a technology, they had industrialized it, simplified it, and distributed it so widely that even their most junior medical personnel could employ it effectively. This was not the enemy Japan had been told to expect. This was not the soft, decadent nation of propaganda speeches. This was an industrial colossus that treated complex medical technology as routine field equipment, that valued individual soldier survival enough to deploy cutting-edge science to the front lines, that possessed supply chains robust enough to deliver fragile biological materials across global distances without degradation. The general set down the bottle carefully, as though it might shatter and take with it the last illusions of Japanese victory. He had commanded armies, planned operations, studied enemy capabilities through intelligence reports and captured documents. But this single medical supply cache revealed a truth more devastating than any battle report. Japan was not fighting a war. Japan was fighting arithmetic. And the numbers, written in bottles of plasma stacked in a muddy tent in Burma, told a story of inevitable defeat. The journey to this moment of terrible recognition had begun years earlier, though few in the Japanese military establishment had understood its significance. While Japan prepared for territorial expansion and military conquest, America had been quietly revolutionizing military medicine. The transformation began not in response to war, but through the convergence of scientific research, industrial capacity, and an American cultural imperative that would prove decisive. The belief that individual lives were worth extraordinary effort to save. In the 1930s, medical researchers across the industrialized world understood the basic principle of blood transfusion. Human blood could be transferred from donor to patient, replacing blood lost through injury and preventing death from hemorrhagic shock. The technique had been employed since the First World War, with varying degrees of success, but whole blood transfusion faced severe practical limitations that made it nearly impossible to employ on battlefields. Fresh whole blood had to be used within hours of collection. It required refrigeration to prevent bacterial growth. It had to be carefully matched by blood type, or it would kill the recipient. It required trained medical personnel to collect, store, transport, and administer. Most critically, it required donors to be physically present near the point of use. All of these constraints meant that blood transfusion remained a hospital procedure, useful only when casualties could be rapidly evacuated to medical facilities with blood banks and laboratory support. For combat medicine, these requirements were insurmountable. Soldiers bled to death from wounds that were not immediately fatal, because shock claimed them before they could reach surgical care. Field medics could bandage wounds, inject morphine for pain, apply tourniquets to stop bleeding, but they could not replace the blood volume lost to trauma. Hemorrhagic shock, the cascade of physiological collapse triggered by severe blood loss, killed tens of thousands of soldiers who might otherwise have survived their injuries. Japanese military medicine understood this problem intimately. During the China campaigns of the 1930s, medical officers documented that approximately 30% of combat deaths occurred not from immediately fatal wounds, but from shock and blood loss hours after injury. Soldiers wounded in remote areas, far from surgical hospitals, died during evacuation. Men who survived initial wounds succumbed to shock before reaching medical care. The problem was recognized, documented, and considered, essentially unsolvable. American researchers approached the same problem with different assumptions. Rather than accepting the limitations of whole blood transfusion, they asked whether blood itself could be transformed into something more practical for combat use. The answer emerged through research conducted at multiple institutions, but particularly at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons, where a team led by Dr. Charles Drew began investigating blood plasma. Plasma is the liquid component of blood, the yellowish fluid that remains after red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are removed. Unlike whole blood, plasma does not require blood type matching. It can be given to any patient regardless of their blood type without triggering fatal transfusion reactions. This universal compatibility made plasma vastly simpler to employ in emergency medicine. But the breakthrough that would transform combat medicine came from a different discovery. Plasma could be dried. Through a process called lyophilization, liquid plasma could be frozen and then subjected to vacuum conditions that removed all water content through sublimation. The result was a dry powder that could be stored at room temperature for months or years, then reconstituted with sterile water when needed. Dried plasma weighed a fraction of whole blood, required no refrigeration, remained stable under field conditions, and could be stockpiled in advance. Dr. Drew's research team, working under funding from the Blood Transfusion Betterment Association, perfected the drying process by 1940. They developed standardized protocols for plasma collection, processing, quality control, and reconstitution. They demonstrated that dried plasma, when properly prepared, was as effective as fresh plasma for treating shock. They proved it could be manufactured at scale, distributed widely, and used by medical personnel with minimal training. When war came to Europe in 1939, the British government immediately recognized the potential. They established blood collection centers across Britain, processing thousands of units of donated blood into dried plasma for military use. American pharmaceutical companies, not yet at war but already supplying Britain through Lend-Lease, scaled up production capacity. By 1941, American industry was producing dried plasma at rates measured in tens of thousands of units monthly. Japanese military intelligence monitored these developments with interest but limited comprehension. Reports from Europe mentioned British use of dried plasma, but the scale and implications were unclear. Japanese military doctors were aware of the technology in theoretical terms. Some had read American and British medical journals discussing plasma research, but the gap between laboratory technique and mass battlefield deployment seemed too large to bridge. Plasma remained, in Japanese military thinking, an experimental treatment of limited practical value. This fundamental misassessment derived partly from Japan's own industrial and organizational constraints. Japanese pharmaceutical industry in the early 1940s was sophisticated but small-scale. Production was oriented toward serving domestic civilian needs and limited military requirements. The concept of mass-producing complex biological products for deployment to frontline troops simply did not fit Japanese industrial or military organizational models. Moreover, Japanese military culture emphasized endurance, stoicism, and acceptance of casualties as inevitable aspects of warfare. Medical care focused on returning lightly wounded soldiers to combat quickly and providing basic comfort to the severely wounded. The idea of investing enormous industrial resources to save individual soldiers who might otherwise die from shock seemed, in the context of Japanese military thinking, wasteful. Resources were finite. They should be allocated to weapons, ammunition, and equipment that enabled offensive action, not to defensive medical care that saved lives, but did not directly contribute to battlefield victory. American military culture operated from profoundly different assumptions. Individual soldier survival was not merely a humanitarian concern, it was a strategic priority that justified enormous investment. This derived partly from American political culture, where citizen soldiers were seen as individuals whose lives had inherent value beyond their military function. But it also derived from practical calculations. Training soldiers was expensive and time-consuming. Replacing combat losses degraded unit cohesion and effectiveness. Any medical intervention that returned wounded soldiers to duty or that prevented preventable deaths represented economic and military value. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the military medical establishment moved with remarkable speed to implement plasma programs on an unprecedented scale. The Surgeon General's office, working with the American Red Cross and pharmaceutical manufacturers, established the plasma program as the highest national priority. Blood donation became a civilian patriotic duty. Collection centers opened in cities across America. Industrial facilities dedicated to plasma processing were constructed or converted from other uses. By mid-1942, American plasma production reached truly industrial scale. The Red Cross coordinated blood donations from millions of American civilians. Pharmaceutical companies processed this donated blood through standardized protocols developed by Dr. Drew's research team. The dried plasma was packaged in standardized bottles with clear labeling, accompanied by simple reconstitution instructions, and shipped to military depots for distribution. The logistics network required to support this program was extraordinary in scope. Dried plasma had to be collected from donors across America, processed at pharmaceutical facilities, quality tested to ensure safety, packaged for military use, transported to port facilities, loaded onto ships, conveyed across oceans through submarine-infested waters, unloaded at forward bases, and finally distributed to frontline medical units. This supply chain had to function reliably under wartime conditions, maintaining cold chain requirements during processing, while the final product remained stable under field conditions. Japanese military planners, observing American operations in the Pacific, noted the presence of extensive medical facilities accompanying American forces. Field hospitals were larger than Japanese equivalents. Medical personnel were more numerous. Casualty evacuation was conducted more aggressively, with wounded soldiers moved rapidly from front lines to surgical care. But the full implications of American medical logistics remained unclear until captured supplies began providing hard evidence. The Burma campaign of 1944 became a revelation for Japanese commanders not merely because of military defeat, but because of what captured American and British supplies revealed about enemy capabilities. Lieutenant General Mutaguchi's 15th Army had launched Operation U-Go in March 1944, an ambitious offensive designed to invade India from Burma, cut Allied supply lines to China, and potentially knock British forces out of the theatre entirely. The operation was planned with typical Japanese optimism about logistics. Soldiers would carry minimal supplies, living off captured enemy stores and local resources. Speed and aggressive offensive action would compensate for logistical weaknesses. Supply lines stretching through mountainous jungle terrain would be maintained through sheer determination and improvisation. The reality proved catastrophic. Allied forces, rather than collapsing under Japanese attack, fought tenaciously and fell back to prepared positions. Japanese supply lines, stretched impossibly thin through some of the world's most difficult terrain, broke down completely during monsoon season. Soldiers ran out of food. Ammunition supplies dwindled. Medical supplies, always scarce, disappeared entirely. Wounded Japanese soldiers died by the thousands, not from their injuries but from infections, shock, and disease that claimed them during the long retreat. Medical officers could do little beyond basic wound care. Infections that penicillin could have cured, still unavailable to Japanese forces, turned minor wounds into death sentences. Blood loss that plasma might have treated instead progressed to irreversible shock. Dysentery and malaria, preventable or treatable with adequate medical supplies, ravaged units more effectively than enemy action. Then, during a brief successful raid on an Allied supply depot, Japanese forces captured intact medical supplies in quantities they had never imagined existed at frontline positions. The discovery was not limited to plasma. There were sulfur drugs in abundance, quinine for malaria treatment, surgical instruments of remarkable quality, bandages, morphine, intravenous fluids, antiseptics, everything needed for complex battlefield medicine, present in quantities that exceeded what Japanese division-level hospitals possessed. But it was the plasma that captured attention because it represented technology Japanese forces did not possess in any quantity, deployed casually by the enemy as routine field equipment. Captain Tanaka, the medical officer examining the captured supplies with General Mutaguchi, had trained at Tokyo Imperial University, one of Japan's premier medical institutions. He understood plasma technology. He knew its value. What shocked him was not that Americans had plasma, but that they had so much of it, deployed so far forward, treated as ordinary medical consumable rather than precious resource to be carefully rationed. He conducted an inventory over the following hours, documenting what had been captured. The single aid station, designed to serve approximately 1,000 troops, contained 247 units of dried plasma. There were also 15 units of dried albumin, a concentrated blood protein used to treat severe shock. The technical manuals included with the supplies were printed in multiple languages, suggesting they were designed for coalition forces. The instructions were illustrated, written at a level that assumed minimal medical training. enabling combat corpsmen to administer plasma in the field without physician supervision. Tanaka calculated the mathematical implications with growing horror. If one small aid station contained nearly 250 units of plasma, if you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And American forces maintained similar medical supply levels at all forward positions, then total American plasma deployment in the theatre must number in the tens of thousands of units. Perhaps hundreds of thousands. The industrial capacity required to produce such quantities boggled comprehension. He shared these calculations with General Mutaguchi that evening, the two men sitting in a leaking tent while rain pounded the jungle outside. The general listened without interrupting, his face expressionless. When Tanaka finished, Mutaguchi asked a single question. "Can we produce this?" Tanaka hesitated, then answered with the honesty of a professional facing impossible reality. "Sir, Japan's entire pharmaceutical industry might produce a few thousand units annually if we dedicated facilities exclusively to plasma production. The Americans appear to be producing hundreds of thousands of units, perhaps millions. The scale is beyond our industrial capacity." The silence that followed was broken only by rain and distant artillery. Finally, Mutaguchi spoke, his voice flat. "They value individual soldiers enough to provide each one with access to technology we cannot manufacture. They possess supply chains capable of delivering complex medical materials to jungle battlefields. They have solved problems we consider unsolvable." He paused, then continued more quietly. "This plasma represents more than medicine. It represents industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, and a military culture fundamentally different from ours. We are not fighting a war of tactics and courage. We are fighting industrial civilization itself." The general's assessment, shared with few others and never officially documented, accurately captured a reality that Japanese military leadership would spend the next 15 months refusing to accept. America had not merely achieved technological advantage in weapons or communications. They had extended technological advantage into military medicine, treating individual soldier survival as a problem worthy of massive industrial and logistical investment. The plasma program represented America's unique combination of capabilities. First, the scientific research base that developed lyophilization technology and plasma processing protocols. Second, the pharmaceutical industry capable of mass-producing complex biological products under sterile conditions. Third, the civilian blood donation infrastructure that provided raw materials from millions of volunteers. Fourth, the logistics network capable of distributing finished products globally. Fifth, the military medical establishment that could train thousands of corpsmen in plasma administration and integrate the technology into battlefield medical care. Japan possessed none of these capabilities in comparable form. Japanese medical research was sophisticated but small-scale, oriented toward laboratory science rather than mass practical applications. Japanese pharmaceutical industry was competent but lacked the production capacity for large-scale biological manufacturing. Japan had no tradition of mass civilian blood donation, no infrastructure for collection and processing. Japanese military logistics struggled to deliver basic supplies to combat zones, let alone complex medical materials requiring specific handling. Japanese military medical training emphasized basic wound care and evacuation, not advanced interventions at the front line. The gap was not merely technological, it was systematic, reflecting fundamental differences in industrial development, organizational culture, and strategic priorities. Closing this gap would have required transforming multiple aspects of Japanese society and industry, investments that would take years even under optimal conditions. By mid-1944, with American forces advancing across the Pacific and Japanese industrial capacity under increasing strain, closing the gap was impossible. Captain Tanaka spent several days examining the captured supplies in detail, conducting an analysis that would never reach official reports but would circulate quietly among Japanese medical officers in Burma. He documented not just the quantities of plasma and other supplies, but their implications for American military effectiveness. His findings were devastating. American combat casualty mortality rates, based on interrogation of prisoners and captured medical records, were approximately half of Japanese rates for comparable wounds. This was not because American soldiers were stronger or tougher, but because they received better medical care faster. Plasma administration within the first hour of injury prevented shock in many cases where Japanese soldiers would have died during evacuation. Sulfur drugs and later penicillin prevented infections that killed countless Japanese wounded. Rapid evacuation to surgical facilities meant Americans received definitive care within hours rather than days. The cumulative effect was profound. American units could sustain higher casualties without combat effectiveness, degrading because wounded soldiers were more likely to survive and return to duty. Japanese units, once casualties accumulated, saw their strength decline irreversibly because many wounded died from preventable causes and few returned to combat status. Tanaka's analysis included specific examples that illustrated the disparity with painful clarity. In a recent engagement, a Japanese battalion had suffered 83 casualties. Of these, 27 died not from their wounds but from shock, infection, or disease during evacuation. Another 15 were permanently disabled by complications that better medical care might have prevented. Only 41 wounded soldiers eventually returned to light duty, and only 12 to full combat status. The battalion had effectively lost more men to inadequate medical care than to enemy action. By contrast, captured American medical records from a unit that had suffered similar casualties showed dramatically different outcomes. Of 80 American soldiers wounded in comparable action, only 8 had died, most from immediately fatal wounds. 63 had been evacuated to surgical facilities within 4 hours. 51 would eventually return to full duty. The Americans, through superior medical care, had converted potential deaths into temporary losses and maintained unit strength. These calculations, shared quietly among Japanese medical officers, contradicted official doctrine that emphasized spirit and endurance over material concerns. But the evidence was undeniable. Medicine, like every other aspect of modern warfare, had become industrialized. Nations with the scientific base, industrial capacity, and logistical sophistication to deploy advanced medical technology held measurable advantages in military effectiveness. General Mutaguchi's 15th Army continued its retreat through Burma into the summer of 1944. The campaign, that had begun with ambitious offensive plans, ended in catastrophic defeat. Of the approximately 85,000 Japanese soldiers who began the offensive, fewer than 30,000 survived to reach relatively safe areas in Burma. The rest died from combat wounds, disease, starvation, and lack of medical care. The retreat became known as the Road of Bones because of the thousands of corpses marking the withdrawal route. American and British forces advancing after the Japanese retreat found evidence of the humanitarian catastrophe. Japanese supply dumps contained virtually no medical supplies. Aid stations had been established in caves and jungle clearings with almost no equipment. Mass graves held hundreds of soldiers who had died from treatable wounds and preventable disease. The contrast with Allied medical facilities, even at remote forward positions, was stark. Allied medical officers examining captured Japanese medical facilities were shocked by the primitive conditions. One British doctor, recording his observations for Medical Corps records, noted that Japanese aid stations lacked basic supplies that Allied forces considered essential for any medical care. There was no plasma, no whole blood, no intravenous fluids of any kind. Sulfur drugs were present in tiny quantities, carefully rationed. Morphine was scarce. Bandages were reused until they fell apart. Surgical instruments, when present, were basic and often improvised from other tools. The doctor concluded his report with an observation that Allied medical officers found disturbing. Japanese military medicine appeared to be operating at standards comparable to European armies during the First World War, before modern military medicine developed. They had made minimal advancement in battlefield medical care, despite 30 years of medical progress. This was not because Japanese doctors lacked knowledge or skill, but because Japanese military logistics and industrial base could not support modern military medicine at scale. News of the plasma discoveries in Burma spread through Japanese military medical circles during the latter half of 1944, carried by officers rotating from combat zones to training positions or administrative roles. The information never became official intelligence reports, partly because it was too devastating to be comfortably acknowledged. But medical officers knew. They understood that the technology gap extended beyond weapons and communications into the fundamental infrastructure of military effectiveness. Some Japanese medical officers, particularly those educated in Western medicine or who had studied abroad before the war, recognized the implications immediately. They understood that plasma represented not merely a medical innovation, but a systematic approach to soldier welfare that reflected America's industrial and cultural advantages. These officers knew that Japan could not replicate American medical capabilities without transforming its entire military medical system, pharmaceutical industry, and logistics infrastructure. Others refused to accept the implications, clinging to traditional beliefs that Japanese soldier spirit would compensate for material disadvantage. They argued that excessive medical care made soldiers soft and dependent, that hardship built character, that accepting casualties stoically was part of Bushido tradition. These officers dismissed plasma and advanced medical care as symptoms of American weakness rather than strength. This division reflected broader tensions within Japanese military culture as defeat became increasingly apparent. Professional officers trained in modern military methods understood that spirit and courage could not overcome massive material disadvantage. Ideological officers, particularly those influenced by ultranationalist thinking, rejected materialist analysis as defeatist and insisted that willpower would ultimately prevail. The result was cognitive paralysis, an inability to adapt strategy to reality. By early 1945, American forces had advanced across the Pacific to the point where they were conducting operations within range of the Japanese home islands. Medical facilities accompanying these operations had reached remarkable levels of sophistication. Hospital ships, converted from merchant vessels, provided surgical capability close to combat zones. Mobile surgical hospitals moved with advancing troops, maintaining operating rooms within range of frontline artillery. Casualty evacuation by air meant severely wounded soldiers reached surgical care within hours of injury. The plasma supply chain now extended across the Pacific to the smallest forward positions. American corpsmen carried individual plasma units in their medical kits. Battalion aid stations maintained stockpiles measured in dozens of units. Regimental and division hospitals had hundreds of units immediately available. Base hospitals kept thousands in reserve. The entire system was designed to ensure that no American soldier died from shock because plasma was unavailable. Japanese medical officers, observing through intelligence reports and captured documents, could only watch this capability with a mixture of professional admiration and strategic despair. The Americans had created a military medical system that treated advanced technology as routine field equipment, that valued individual soldier survival enough to invest enormous resources in medical care, that possessed the industrial and logistical capacity to maintain such a system across global theaters of war. Japan, facing invasion of the home islands, struggled to provide its soldiers with basic supplies. Medical facilities on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, where Japanese forces fought desperate defensive battles in early 1945, were primitive, even by Japanese standards. Wounded soldiers were left in caves with minimal care. Medical personnel could do almost nothing beyond providing morphine for pain and attempting basic wound cleaning. Plasma, sulfur drugs, and other advanced supplies existed only in tiny quantities, carefully hoarded for the most critical cases. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April through June 1945, provided the final and most devastating comparison of medical capabilities. American forces suffered approximately 12,000 killed and 38,000 wounded during the campaign. Japanese defenders suffered approximately 77,000 killed with perhaps 10,000 wounded captured. The disparity in killed-to-wounded ratios was striking. American forces, with superior medical care, saw roughly 1 death for every 3 wounded. Japanese forces saw more than 7 dead for every wounded survivor. This difference reflected not merely combat intensity, but medical effectiveness. American wounded were rapidly evacuated, received plasma to treat shock, underwent surgery within hours, and survived wounds that would have been fatal without advanced care. Japanese wounded, trapped in caves and bunkers, died from shock, blood loss, and infection that claimed them over hours and days. Many who might have survived with proper medical care instead became casualties of inadequate support. American medical facilities on Okinawa represented the apex of battlefield medicine. Hospital ships offshore provided immediate surgical capability. Mobile hospitals established on captured territory moved forward as the front advanced. Air evacuation transported the most seriously wounded to larger facilities on nearby islands. Plasma was administered routinely, often within minutes of injury. Whole blood, flown in from blood banks in Hawaii and Guam, supplemented plasma supplies for severe cases. Japanese defenders had no comparable infrastructure. Medical caves were established in limestone formations across the island, but these lacked basic supplies and equipment. Wounded soldiers were brought to these aid stations and provided whatever minimal care was possible before being left to recover or die as circumstances permitted. Medical personnel worked with almost no supplies, no anesthesia beyond morphine, minimal surgical instruments, and no means of treating shock or infection effectively. The captured diary of a Japanese medical officer on Okinawa, found after the battle and later translated by American intelligence, provided heartbreaking documentation of this disparity. The officer, a trained surgeon, described trying to perform amputations without anesthesia, treating sucking chest wounds with improvised bandages, watching men die from shock because he had no means of replacing lost blood. His final entries, written as American forces overran his position, expressed not bitterness, but professional despair at the impossibility of providing adequate care with available resources. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the plasma program had distributed approximately 12 million units to American forces worldwide. Millions more had been provided to British, Soviet, and other Allied forces through Lend-Lease. The program had established blood donation as a civic duty, with millions of American civilians contributing blood over the course of the war. It had created a pharmaceutical industry capability for mass biological product manufacturing that would become the foundation for post-war medical advances. It had demonstrated that complex medical technology could be deployed at scale and integrated into military operations across global theaters. Most significantly, it had saved an estimated hundreds of thousands of lives. Soldiers who would have died from shock in previous wars survived because plasma prevented cardiovascular collapse. Wounded men who would have died during evacuation reached surgical care in stable condition. Burns and traumatic injuries that would have been fatal were now survivable. The plasma program, combined with other medical advances like sulfur drugs and penicillin, had transformed military medicine from palliative care to active life-saving intervention. Japan had possessed none of this capability. Japanese military medicine remained fundamentally unchanged from earlier decades, constrained by limited industrial capacity, inadequate logistics, and cultural assumptions that prioritized offensive capability over defensive medical care. The result was preventable deaths measured in hundreds of thousands. Soldiers who died from treatable wounds and shock, from infections that antibiotics could have cured, from lack of medical supplies that Allied forces possessed in abundance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.